How you doing today, Andrew?
Good. Doing great. Excited for the topic we're going to be discussing. So I think it'll be interesting and informative and something good and quick that everybody can at least research and listen to. So,
yeah, for sure. So today's topic is actually going to be Eisenhower's farewell speech. Eisenhower's speech was famous for several reasons, but most famously, it was the first time the public had ever heard of a military-industrial complex. I think he was actually coined with giving it that term, but
believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people, when he came out and had that speech, never heard it before, was kind of like, what is he talking about? What does this mean? A lot of the topics we've covered from Ray Dalio's book, some of the other topics that you'll see as they come out, is just really us trying to understand the world, understand our country. And when you go back to moments in history like Eisenhower's speech, it makes some of the things that are happening today, helps them make a lot more sense. You can kind of wrap your head around some of the current events and maybe why politicians and corporations do some of the things they do, which we'll talk about today too. But before we get into all that, I wanted to circle back, give a little bit of insight into a quick summary about what Eisenhower's speech covered, and then we'll talk about what the military-industrial complex is for anyone who doesn't know. So a couple things that were that happened during, or that he talked about during his speech. One was a military-industrial complex. I've been having trouble saying that all night. But he's also expressed a bunch of concerns about planning for the future and the dangers of massive spending, especially deficit spending. So there's a couple financial concerns that were brought up in his speech. But the military-industrial complex was the most famous. That happened on January 17th, 1961, which is the date of his farewell speech. So a little bit of insight. What is the military-industrial complex? So it's basically, you could call it a partnership that takes place between a country's military and the powers that be. I guess you could call it the politicians, the government, and it creates an area where there's a vested interest in public policy, and then decisions are made based off that interest that profit both parties involved, really. So you can think, about a lot of the wars, why certain actions have been done. If you want to talk about current events, relatively current, when we pulled out of Afghanistan a little bit ago, we left, I think it was something like $80 billion of equipment in Afghanistan, just turned it over to the Talibans. To a lot of people, that didn't make sense. To people who think about the military-industrial complex, I did it again. Hey, actually, I was joking with Andrew before we started rolling on the podcast, saying that I think I should
it Mike.
Yeah, I think I should call the military-industrial complex Mike. And on the Wikipedia page, it actually says military-industrial complex, and then in parentheses MIC, Mike. So I'm going to call it Mike for the rest of the night because I'm going to keep having a tongue twister.
No worries.
But back to Afghanistan. So to people who are thinking about Mike, it actually makes quite a bit of sense why we would make a decision like that to leave all of that equipment there. And it's because new government contracts will have to be written, new orders will have to be fulfilled. And so companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all of these big military suppliers, they're going to profit off of just leaving that equipment there because the government's going to need more of it. So that's essentially what very high level, what the mic is just basically a partnership where the government and the military suppliers have a vested interest in certain events and certain policies
and
that are written.
Yeah, influencing public policy, right? So like the whole concept is that there's cahoots between the private industry and the military, and therefore they each kind of feed each other. And again, it's similar. I know we've talked about like the similarities between companies like in the pharmaceutical industry, right? So companies maybe like a Pfizer or whatever is very close in relationship to the FDA, right? Because in some ways it makes sense. They have to work closely with each other. The FDA regulates pharmaceutical companies, but at some point you get to this like where the relationship is too nestled together, where people are leaving the FDA and going to work for Pfizer and getting big money for it. And at some point, this can become, essentially, it can become manipulative to public policy and essentially corrupt at some level as well, because you're going to do things potentially as maybe a government advisor or a government employee to make a very powerful company happy, because you know that that could help you later on in life, or it could benefit one of your children or your cousin or your wife or whomever. So the idea of the military industrial complex is that, and Eisenhower kind of starts off early in his speech, essentially discussing how, earlier in his life, there's never been this idea of a military, right? I know we talked about before, Jeff, and it was an interesting fact that companies that used to make, well, he even says it himself, companies that used to make plowshares are now, reorganize themselves to build swords, right? Or to build guns. And that was a true thing during World War II, right? Because like I remember my uncle has one of those 30 carbine rifles, and it's like that short 15 shot carbine that was like very popular during World War II. He has that rifle, and that rifle was actually made by General Motors. So you can kind of see that like there wasn't this like industry in place to build guns and to build weapons and bombs, and that had to be built in order to meet the war demands of World War II. But in prior to World War II, you didn't have a full-on industry supplying military weaponry at the level it later occurred during World War II and then after World War II. And so that growing military, right, it needs to be serviced. It becomes a beast of its own, right? I know he mentioned like 3 million people after World War II were employed in this military industrial complex. That's real jobs. That's developing real power. And the military, America becoming a superpower after World War II, needs to sustain that military and needs to sustain its superpower, right? So even as Ray Dalio talks, like every superpower needs a strong military, or that's at least what they've done, right? In order to maintain their power, right? Their power grip over the world and maintain that reserve currency. You need that big military. But never before had America really experienced that. America was sort of the underdog, right? It was the Britain that had the big military, maybe Germany before that, or coincided. So you had other countries that had large militaries and maybe did have some more industrial capacity, but after World War II, the whole ball game changed. And I think Eisenhower, being a military man, just another little background about him, he was the commander, the general that led the operation in Africa against the Nazis, right? That was like the first real battles between the US and the Nazis and Germany, and the Axis powers was in North Africa. So Eisenhower oversaw that. He oversaw the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. So this is a guy and he had experience before that in World War I. So he's seen war. He's been around war. He's been around the military his whole career in service. And so he's a guy that's very keen to the military, but he's also waking up to the idea, and he's seen how it's progressed from a small military that we had maybe in World War I to what we had following World War II and into the Korean War. And this whole bureaucracy has made him, skeptical of the trajectory of our country. Mm-hmm. And I think those are just the important things to recognize with his speech, is that, it sets the background a little bit, is that he's really seen this whole shift from a non-superpower to a superpower, and how this military industrial complex has grown and has become so bureaucratic and very powerful, to the point where now these corporations can lobby, can spend a ton of money, getting essentially donating to political campaigns, and making sure that military spending and the budget keeps increasing every year and year. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what he's woken up to, waking up the American people to.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. And I think a big takeaway for that, at least for me, when I first watched the video of his speech, you can see it on YouTube. You can read about it too, but you start to have this level of concern where the government or politicians in the government, special interest groups, corporations, lobbyists, they start to make decisions, both political and global decisions, whether it's, certain policies that are being passed and or getting involved in certain wars. You can't help but wonder and feel concerned that maybe the decisions that they're making are in the best interest of profits and not in the best interest of people. Because at the end of the day, when we get involved in wars, it's Americans that are out fighting that. And I think the concern is that maybe these corporations and maybe these individuals, they lose sight of that, and they just really think about what's best for the business, what's best for profit and for money, and they don't think about the people that have to endure the costs of that.
Have to serve. Yeah. Well, I know, even more recently, I think we've talked about this as well. I believe was it Rob O'Neill I just don't want to get his name wrong. Rob O'Neill. Yeah, I believe that's who it was. Yeah, Rob O'Neill was one of the Navy SEALs that killed bin Laden, was on the raid for bin Laden. And I was listening to him on another podcast. And essentially what was really interesting is that as he's talking, he's asked a question like, oh, would you would you do this? Would you have served again? And he's like, knowing what I know now, he's so jaded, right? Because when he first started, he didn't know about this idea of the military industrial complex, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he thought, hey, I'm going to go serve my country. I'm going to go, fight. We just got attacked. Or I don't know when he actually started his military career, but essentially he went in with a patriotic fervor to serve our country, right? To serve the United States. And as he started going up the ladder and becoming more aware and reading and seeing what was happening with the wars and everything, his mind really shifted. And he's like, we're pawns, essentially, and that to me is like a really powerful thing, because you're a guy, like an elite soldier, right? Like the most elite you can get, SEAL Team 6. So you're the elite of the elite, just to become a Navy SEAL, you have to be elite. And then to make it into SEAL Team 6, like, you're the best of the best. So those are the guys that are doing the highest profile, or the hardest missions on Earth. Mm-hmm. are these guys. And so they're not dummies. They're smart. They're physically strong. They're mentally strong. And I think somebody who's been in that process, that's been to war, that's been seen these things, like, his mindset is, hey, whoa, like, we're this whole military. Yeah, I'm an American. I love America, but we're pawns in this big game. The soldiers are. And it's essentially becoming a game, right? It's how do we make money? no big military contractor will say that, but that's the reality of it. All the big military contractors are, they're all, publicly traded corporations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they all exist to produce profits for their shareholders. And if that align, and if war is good for business, they won't outwardly say, "Hey, we want a war," but if it's good for business, they're happy, right? If they're serving their shareholders. So it's not necessarily always a malicious thing that they have out there, but it's their business, right? And if their business is profitable during wartime, they're happy about it, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly from the corporation standpoint, because it is their business. But that, I think, that's where it's so important to have good government officials to be able to draw the line and say, hey, be able to differentiate the moments where something is good for business and what's also good for the country, and to be able to add some separation there, so you can be.
I think
you can
too,
treat people
the
fairly.
biggest thing, exactly. There needs to be. You're right. There needs to be some checks and balances, and I think that's why also like corporations shouldn't have the pull they have when it comes to supporting candidates, being as involved in the political process. I think it's good from the standpoint of, hey, these are good business practices and advice should be taken when new regulations are to come out. And so I think there needs to be a channel of communication between corporations and politicians, right? Because let's say there's a rule on the books or a law that's on the books that doesn't make sense, that's antiquated, and it's hindering business and efficiency. Like, those things should be stopped, right? But at the same time too, when you have too tight of a relationship, it can lend itself to later corruption, right? And I think that's something that needs to be people need to be aware of. And then I think the other thing is that people need to be educated. You need to educate yourself about the military industrial complex, educate yourself about how corporations function, who they're there to serve, right? And they're there to serve and make profit for shareholders. And that's what they care about at the end of the day. And they do this cost benefit thing. Like, hey, if there's going to be a lawsuit, and maybe you can even talk about the Ford Pinto example, and there's many, many others, where, corporations do an analysis of, hey, this new product, what's our downside? How much money can we make off of it? And what are the cons if we put this product to market? And pharmaceutical companies do that all the time, and many other companies, because everything's a cost benefit. If they put something on the market that they might get sued for, they want to have a good idea as to how much they're going to get sued for. So they know that they can still make a profit on that product. So it's all a game in that way.
I think it's important to I think it goes without saying, but in case there is any sort of misconception, like, neither you or I are anti-military in any sense. I know both of us have an immense respect for people that serve, for our soldiers. I know you in particular love history. You love reading about World War I and World War II, specifically. So this is not in any way meant to discredit or paint any sort of a bad picture of our military, because it's extremely important to have a strong military and to have good companies behind them, supporting them with good tools. But there does have to be some sort of a conversation had, and you should look at it a little critically, because if the relationship between the corporations and the politicians gets a little too close and a little too interrelated, then you have the potential for poor decision making, where you're doing things in the best interest of profits and not people. And that's all we're trying to raise awareness to right now, is just that it's literally just walking that fine line.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that was a great way of putting it. And things are very complex, right? So I think for most viewers, if somebody says, hey, I have the answer and this is it, that's probably not it. Things are very multifaceted. I hear people sometimes say like, oh, the government's shit, we don't need the government. Well, it's like, go to some countries that don't have a strong government and see what it's like to live there. And I guarantee you don't want to live there. But then at the same time too, when government hinders, let's say this, I don't know, I'll throw it out there, the state of California, right? I know there was like a thing I was watching Bill Maher a little while back, and he I guess he wanted to put solar panels on his house or something like that. And he was on day 800 of just getting approval in order to get the permits to put them on this roof or something stupid. And it's there can become a point where government is inefficient, where it overpromises goods for its people. And so it's very important to be aware of that too. So neither is government good nor wholly bad. There's something in the middle, but I think it's important for people to wake up and realize where that middle sweet zone is, right? So that, our rights are protected, but at the same time, we also have a government that's not infringing on our rights, but is also providing the services that we need. And I think both of those things are competing interests, but it's important to have both, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's important to recognize as well.
Yeah. And I know you talked about the Ford Pinto case a little bit, and the reason that's a great example is because while it's not military related, it is a little glimpse into how companies think in terms of decision making, particularly when they're put into an uncomfortable position. So I have an article here. I'll share my screen. So for anyone who is listening to this and you want to see this, you can check us out on YouTube if you didn't know, and you can read along. But so basically, a little backstory, because the article's long. We can include it in the show notes and you can read it for yourself. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I will do a quick summary of what happened. So around the early 70s, the government had there was laws in place where they wanted certain safety standards. They wanted to up the safety standards on cars. I don't remember if it was the late 70s or the early 80s. At some point, and I remember my dad's way more into cars, especially the classic cars. He knows a lot about them. But there was I want to say it was the late 70s or early 80s were some of the shittiest cars America's ever made, unfortunately. So I don't know if this was taking place in that time and that was the inspiration for the new laws, but basically they had, so I'll highlight this so you can see what I'm about to read, but there was an issue with the Ford Pinto, which a lot of people know, some people don't, where they would catch fire. They had a gas tank that I think was in a weird position of the car. It was in a weird placement. And then on top of that, whatever the material was used or how the gas tank was reinforced was really weak. So if they were rear-ended, there was gas leaks all the time and fires and hazardous. So long story short, I'll read it now. So before producing the Ford Pinto, Ford crash tested various prototypes, in part to learn whether they met a safety standard proposed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to reduce fires from traffic collisions. So there you go. They were having an issue with this. They wanted to up the standards. The standard would have required that by 1972, all new autos be able to withstand a rear end impact of 20 miles per hour without fuel loss. And that by 1973, they'd be able to withstand an impact of 30 miles per hour. So each year they're upping the bar, trying to make cars safer and safer for higher impact collisions. The prototypes all failed the 20 mile per hour test. Then in 1970, Ford crash tested the Pinto itself, and the result was the same: ruptured gas tanks and dangerous leaks. The only Pintos to pass the test had been modified in some way. Modifications for this included a rubber bladder in the gas tank. So I guess they lined the inside of the gas tank somehow. And then a piece of reinforced steel between the tank and the rear bumper. So I think this is like coming back to me a little bit more. I think that the gas tanks were in like more of the rear of the car. I guess I don't know if that was not par for the course at the time. But long story short, Ford knew before they released the Pinto that this was an issue. They knew that that the car was not up to safety standards and that there was a potential for fires, there was a potential for gas leaks. They knew all of that before it even left the production line, and yet they continued to go through with that anyway. They didn't recall the vehicles, at least not immediately. They may have later on. They could have postponed production and gotten the safety standards up, but at that time, the Ford Pinto was introduced to compete with the Japanese market. So I think like Toyotas were becoming more popular and they were selling more. And so they wanted to rush this thing to market so that there was an American version of this like fuel efficient type car. And that was more important to them than making a good quality product. That was more important to them than keeping people safe. And so that is a glimpse. Like I said, it's not an exact one-for-one with the military industrial complex, but it gives you insight into how sometimes business decisions are made. And a lot of times it's not in the interest of people. It's not in the interest of families buying these cars and driving their kids to and from school who may get into an accident at 20 miles per hour and have the car catch fire. They're not thinking about that. All they care about is they need to beat they need to be more competitive in the market. They need to try to reintroduce some new, or not reintroduce, but introduce a new concept that's more competitive. And that's the most important thing to them. And that's a lot of businesses. So yeah, just something to think about.
I think that's a great example. And there's many, many more, I think, like that. Even a more recent example would be like the Volkswagen example, where I think it was their diesel cars. They essentially, when you would test them, I guess, on the dyno tune or whatever the heck it's called, you would probably know better than me. You're more of a car guy. But they would put, when you'd put one of these Volkswagens for testing in I guess a lab or in a garage, right, and had it run, it wouldn't admit the insane amount of, I guess, pollutants into the air. So it would pass the EPA test, right? But then when these cars would go onto the road and they were tested, and it ended up being like, I think somebody, like a student or something that did this testing, for like a scientific thing, something for school, I believe. And they put the tester on the car while they were driving it on like real world conditions, right? Real road conditions. Like it was emitting like, I forget what it was, but it was an astronomical amount of like particulate matter. And it was like many, many times more than what the EPA would have allowed. And Volkswagen had to pay a tremendous amount of money in fines. And it was a big deal when it happened, and it wasn't that long ago, maybe like 10 years ago.
I remember when that happened. Yeah.
So again, like, yeah, I mean, again, corporations are not always going to do the right things, right? And so I think that's why people need to wake up to corporate power. They need to wake up to the idea that, corporations are not there to serve the people. They're there to serve the shareholders. And as our country, like in Ray Dalio's book, as our country becomes, as the wealth divide is widening, right? The middle class is becoming weaker in this country. The poor are becoming poorer. The rich are becoming ever more richer. We have to wake up to this fact, and things need to change, because corporations, again, are not there for the average person. They're there for the shareholder. And people that own shares tend to be people on the wealthier side of society, right? And it's evident. I mean, if you look at people's like wealth growth through, the pandemic, it's amazing. The people who have a tremendous amount of assets are doing better than ever, and people who don't really have a lot of assets are getting squeezed. Think about people that rent, right? If you rent rented, your rents are going through the roof. You're not really making much more money. But maybe if you own, let's say, a couple houses and a rental here, a rental there, you're still getting rent. Your house values have all gone up. You're actually doing better than you were before the pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just evident that things are becoming wider. There's more of a wealth gap. We are progressing we are in probably stage 5, like Ray Dalio says, of a rise and fall of a nation, a great power. So we need to wake up to that. Like, corporations don't have the average person's best interests at heart. They have the bottom line at heart.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a few other key constituents, right? The regulators, that's what they care about.
I think too.
So it's just the evident truth.
Yeah, it is. No, it's true. And I think it's worth mentioning, because I have a feeling there's quite a few people out there who don't know this, and I'm sure there's some that do know this, but there are teams within corporations. They don't all do this, but a lot of them do. In decisions like with Volkswagen, I'm sure that somewhere in some meeting room this took place. I know it's happened a lot with pharmaceutical companies. They're probably the most popular or the most well-documented corporations to do this, but there are teams that do like damage control. Like, they figure out like an estimation of how much they're going to have to pay in fines or how much they're going to have to pay in lawsuits. And they compare that to what the potential sales are. And if the sales are still more profitable, there's a good chance that they're just going to move forward and say, hey, you know what? We'll put it out. We'll pay whatever fines or whatever lawsuits we incur, because we know at the end of the day, it's more profitable to go this route than, say, either one, just completely can the idea and start over and lose all of the time and money spent in research and development, or even recall the product and try to revamp it and do another version of it. Like, all of that costs money. It's, even when you recall something, it goes back into R&D to figure out what components need to be replaced, and then you have to go and deal with manufacturers and model new things. And there's a lot, when you roll that out on a huge scale, that's expensive. So it's not uncommon for them to do like a sort of damage control and just weigh the odds. So know that too. Like, as an individual, when you're, reading about the world and trying to learn new things and understand how finance works and how companies work, and be mindful of that. Learn to question things, learn to think a little bit outside the box, and I don't know. I'm not going to call out any companies here in particular, because I don't know any off the top of my head, but I know for a fact if you start Googling that and you start researching, you'll go down a rabbit hole of all sorts of types of damage control situations like that. It's a common practice.
Yeah. I mean, I know, that's definitely, I think, a big common practice in the pharmaceutical industry, right? Because you don't always know with drugs what are going to be all the side effects. How many? There's going to be a percentage of people that are going to have bad reaction that you may get sued from, but hopefully that medication serves more good than bad. But it's a weighed analysis. Like, how much, if we put this product to market, how much are we going to get sued on it, and how much profit do we think we're going to make? And if we're going to make profit, maybe they're going to be willing to do that, right? If there's not too much reputational damage or risk to them. So I think it's just, the general thing is just to beware of corporations, beware of politicians that, that say they have the answer, right? Or beware of also both corporations and politicians that put fear into people, right? Or say that there's a crisis or something of great magnitude that needs addressing, right? Because that's the essence of Eisenhower's speech, is that crises will arise, right? And the government and this new military industrial complex is going to want to use its resources and power to solve that crisis. And Eisenhower talks about this directly. He says, crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. When I'm just reading that, just off like just a person, like that studies World War II history, it almost sounds like exactly what kind of like Hitler was pushing, right? Like, there's a crisis with, not having enough living space and what the Jewish people are destroying this country. And, that like you make people afraid, right? And you point out something that needs to be solved and there's a crisis and what's happening with our country. And therefore that's what, gets people to want to, all right, yeah, maybe we do need to invade. Maybe, communism is spreading, right? That was the big thing from after World War II. And we need to, if we just go into Korea and just, stop the communists from invading from the north, like we're gonna solve this issue and communism will stop spreading. And so they develop these crises, right? And I know we're going to talk too about JFK as well, maybe in the next discussion, because we were thinking about maybe covering his peace speech to American University, because JFK was a big proponent as well of keeping the peace and not using our military. Again, a guy who served directly in World War II. And knew the horrors of the war and was injured in World War II. So his push too comes a little bit later, a few years later, but he also focuses on the U.S. not getting involved militarily in these costly wars and not being swayed by the military brass and the military industrial complex and the private industry that wants these wars. And so Eisenhower goes on to say a huge increase in newer elements of our defense, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research, and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. And then he later then talks about, like, he repeatedly says that you need balance in what you're doing. You need balance in the public economy. You need to weigh the cost and the hope for advantage, and you need balance between those two. The balance between action of the moment and the national welfare of the future. So thinking of the future, hey, maybe we don't want to get involved in this costly military exercise because it will have to take on debt and will burden the future generation with that debt. Those are all like important things that he brings up, and it's just like amazing. I wish our government officials, I wish our presidents after the fact, like actually, listened to the speech and took some, notes and actually lived by a couple of these things, because it's so important to realize like the power the military industrial complex has, and how we can easily slip into wars. And we went into, Vietnam afterwards. We've had many operations down in South America. We've done regime change in Iran, and now look how messed up Iran is right now, right? Like we tried to install the Shah, and the Iranians revolted against that, and like we screwed up that country too. We went into Afghanistan, complete debacle. I mean, I don't know if Afghanistan's any better than it was before. And all we were trying to do really was to go after, Osama bin Laden, who was hiding out in Pakistan. So, and then we also got rid of Saddam, right? And left Iraq to be a complete mess, and which, Saddam was a horrible person. Maybe Iraq is a little bit better than what it would have been before, but who really knows how many Iraqis had to die and go through all that. So why are we getting involved in all these costly wars and we haven't listened to our predecessors? And that's, again, why I love history, is because I love to watch and listen and read the mindsets of people from the past as they were going through, important milestone events in history, because you can then apply it to where we are today and gain some, that's essentially the point of history, right? Learn the mistakes of the past so you don't perpetuate them into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to study history, and it's so important to study history and read things like this speech, because it's just as applicable as it was in 1961. I believe that's when it was, right? 1961.
Yeah.
It's just as applicable today. So awesome speech to listen to, and it's not that long either. So highly recommend.
Oh, that's awesome. I think that was great. If you
it wasn't really quite an ending, but
yeah,
but I think I think that kind of, I mean, sums up a lot of it. You know, I think, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I was going to say, I know that wasn't planned, but that was a perfect way to end this and segue into...
to kind of end it.
Yeah, segue into, you know, our next speech, which we'll be covering JFK's, so...
Yeah, JFK's peace speech. And again, it only comes out a couple years later, and essentially it's just a big focus on education. He gives the speech to a graduating class at American University, and essentially just says, hey, we need to invest, as we do in our military, right? We need to invest just as much, if not more, combating ignorance, because if we have ignorant people in this country and running this country and in positions of power, you know, we can go down a very dangerous path, and essentially we can go into self-annihilation, right? With the Russians and through the Cold War, and we may actually start using nuclear weapons, which would be destructive for everybody, right? It could be the end of humanity and of future generations. So again, just study history, listen to Eisenhower's speech. It's really a beautiful speech. I mean, we could go on and on about it, but I think, you know, those are kind of the high level points, and just, you know, our takeaways as well from it.
Or if you want to really have some fun with history, come hang out with us and listen to it.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Night.
All right. Take care.